Yeah, I think this is okay. Can everyone see it? Everyone else?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Okay, great. Sorry for this delay. My role here or this session, I named it How to Make the Knowledge I Produce the Public Policy Issue Relevant Without Turning into Policy Analyst. So basically, the rationale, Tina, can you go to the next slide? Let me introduce myself quickly. My name is Srđan Đurović. I work at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, but I'm a bit in my capacity of a policy analyst for years, actually. I've been working in the civil society organization, the foundations, and been engaged with the public policies and public policies analysis. And the rationale for this, can we get the next slide, please, Tina?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not seeing it.
Not. We see the first slide still.
Yeah.
Okay. Just a second.
Yeah, you have shared probably the presentation or probably the PowerPoint, but not the presentation. So we're not seeing when you're changing.
You need to go on display as a presentation and then share it. Now?
Lucas CUNRI has started screen sharing.
Oh my God. Okay, so basically the question of this half hour is how to make the knowledge I produced, because you have a very previous slide, please, Dina. This is the third.
Okay.
Yeah. So the motive is basically, the task you have before you as your contractual obligation during the fellowship, which is something we call writing an op-ed. I'm saying this op-ed because this is very conditionally called op-ed, but some sort of a derivative product of your research project, which you have been awarded fellowship for. So basically, the policy of this fellowship is we're going to get 2 for 1, and that is a solid body of scientific research in terms of, new knowledge and probably an article about what you've been supported to do. But also the second thing is that we would like to get something, a derivative product from your research. So the rationale for the task is basically the idea is the evidence-based decision-making and informed choices of the public. So, obviously it's connected to the role of engaged social sciences and humanities and how to actually bridge the gap between academic and public discourses. In that sense, the next slide, please, Tina. The question of this half hour, which presentation is going to be a bit shorter because now I've already taken 5 with the technical difficulties, is how to make knowledge I produced a public policy issue relevant without turning into policy analyst. And as usually I know, is that public policy is kind of an area in which many people doing in social sciences, but particularly humanities, are not very willing to venture into. And I think for some good reasons as well. But so the intention of this workshop is definitely not to turn into policy analyst, but it's also not to provide you with a template for writing this paper. The task I've set for this half hour is for me to introduce to you the notion of public policy and explore different ways of seeing public policy, which I feel could be instrumental for you writing this paper and you locating yourself to this new kind of a derivative paper writing, which is similar but not the same as the academic writing. My second task is to provide you tips for locating your research in the policy cycle. It's a bit of a technical term, but that's what I'm going to elaborate. To provide some tips for writing actually the derivative paper, and obviously to answering the questions you might have after this presentation. Next slide, please, Tina. So the notion of public policy. I'll start with the definition, as usually people do, and this is a pretty wide and generally used. I think this definition is one of those overquoted, very vague, and very kind of prone to different interpretations, but probably that's because it was quoted. And that is that the public policy is a relatively stable, purposive course of action, followed by an actor or set of actors in dealing with a problem or a matter of concern. The birthplace of this definition, but also public policy as a notion, is basically the studies of public administration. And the favorite actor of these public administrations, obviously state and state agencies. And we usually see it as kind of very state-centered in terms of what state does to resolve any specific social problem. Its favorite place of residence in terms of analyzing and talking about this is government strategic and planning committees. And that is basically the prime actor of policy analysts very often when they try to engage in a policy cycle. The alternative residence in recent years are think tanks. And this is specific civil society organizations which claim to specialize in public policy analysis and very often take a thematic approach, but also very wide approach, saying we just analyze different public policies. The life cycle of public policies, stemming from this definition, and usually used in terms of defining what the public policy in terms of time span is, it has 3 phases, and that is planning, implementation, and evaluation. And the public policy discourse enjoys cost-benefit analysis. Whenever you try to engage with specific public policies, you engage with the public policy analysis. However, what I'm going to try here, because this is not the public policy 101, is try to present you 2 alternative ways of actually looking at the public policy. And I've called it the engineering mind and administrative mind, which is one, and the second is the social and political mind. How it's dominantly seen, basically, the public policy framework functions as an action-fixed problem matrix, which is basically there is a certain problem which desires certain action, and this problem needs to be fixed. And the key concerns in generally approaching and discussing this is key questions very often asked from this perspective of administrative and engineering mind is the plan technically feasible? Is the plan the best possible plan in terms of different policy approaches? Because obviously we could have a problem, but could have different solutions to it. And very often this is actually very much accented in terms of even writing policy papers, as I'll come to that a bit later, and that is always look at different options to solving a particular problem. And also the third is the plan efficient both in terms of impact and resources? The key features of this approach or this mind is that it sees only explicit and formalized policies with clear ownership and jurisdiction. And usually when we say public policies, we think of education policy or social security policy or particular health policies and so on. But also those policies are not the only policies, but also there are implicit policies, but I'll come to that. In terms of specific actor, which is involved in basically all these stages of public policy is a state. And it's usually seen as the state which is having to do something. And then obviously the analysis and people who are analyzing public policy are actually going towards and communicating with the state. The type of the policy analysis is basically policy options weighing, as I've mentioned. And it's usually consisting of cost-benefit analysis, which is, am I getting value for money, or is this policy options in terms of impact doing more harm than good, or and so on. So these kinds of problem-related, this matrix of problem solution is actually dictating how we are actually seeing this. And in terms of specific policy cycle, it's something that is administratively set. And very often when you actually read about a specific public policy written by the specific government agency, when it tells you about the public policy cycles, it actually tells you about its own strategic and planning cycles. And that is, when are we going to adopt this? When do we have a discussion stage? When we are going to have implementation stage, and so on and so forth. So it's basically administratively driven and administratively set. Next slide, please. And it's basically looking like this. The policy cycle is something that whenever we speak about public policies, you're going to understand, because it has this time dimension, but also it has these political processes I mentioned, which is where are the points in the process where you can actually somehow influence it. Usually it's agenda setting, identify the problem of an issue, formulation and adoption, that is impact assessment and gathering of staff reports, information for decision-making bodies, implementation in terms of specific protocols, regulations, guidance for the provider of the services, and so on and so forth. So it's basically all these set of instruments needed for the policies to be implemented, but also providing adequate resources and mechanisms for this policy to be implemented. The third phase is usually evaluation of efficiency and effectiveness, and that is when we come to the close to the public policy cycle, we go into some kind of evaluation, and then finally we have support, follow-up, and however you want to call it, but that's the final stage, which is basically, you know, the lessons learned and how are we going to, is this cycle going to be kind of closed, and are we again going to go into agenda setting and so forth. From this perspective, to be honest, looking at the profile of the participant, I think very little of your projects when looking at it, and very little of your profile is actually going to find this very appealing or very go forward to kind of engage yourself with the public policies. So there is this alternative perspective which I want to bring in, and it's perspective which is also taken up in development of the public policy studies, but it's also something that is, I've added a bit on things from my own experience in terms of how these goggles might be better for you to try to make the research you already made kind of relevant for specific policies and kind of influential in the public sphere in terms of you can kind of not only direct it to your academic audience, but also to a wider audience. So basically the logical matrix in this is not, as we've had previously, problem, solution, fixed problem in terms of simple logic of intervention and action from perspective of single actors. But it's basically saying that, you know, when we look at the world around us, there is a social condition which is not a social problem. Social problem is something which we frame, we single out of the social condition, and then when we try to resolve the problem, we go into social action. And that social action has some consequences, and there are also social consequences, and those social consequences then produce some type of social change. The accent here is obviously on social, but it's basically the idea that it's not only a single actor, but it's actually a wider number of actors which are involved in this, but also that it's not only that we can see the effects of policy in terms of different impacts it has, or the problems with the feasibility, or problems with the solution, or with the lack of capacities, or with the lack of implementation, but it's also how we perceive social change and how is this policy trying to influence it. From that term, it's basically seeing a policy change as some sort of social change and asking what is the theory of change? What is the logic behind specific measures and how is that going to change? And is that theory of change very successful? If you look for example, the transition in these countries that we are, this fellowship is kind of located in, and the processes of transition, there was very often the idea that the institutional design is going to kind of be a solution for everything. And we look at the legal solutions, very often they will kind of, if we find the right institutional design for whatever, fighting against the corruption or democratizing our societies and so on, if we find the right institutions, we'll see the social change, but that never actually happened. And we've seen that the limits of seeing only through institutional setting, as the previous framework does, it's not very effective in terms of actually producing social change. The second issue that this kind of mind worries about is what are the values underpinning the plan and underpinning the problem definition. Because it's not always the matter of instrumentalist weighing of different options in terms of their effectiveness, but it's also of desirability of the changes and the consequences that is going to make. In that sense, that is something that I feel is a bit more already opening up the framework for social scientists and humanities scholars to kind of locate themselves into. This shift, this kind of change of perspective, so basically makes different shifts. It's a shift from implicit to explicit policies. So we are not talking anymore only of fixed formalized policies, which are found in some strategies or documents or legal frameworks, but we are talking about the implicit policies, or something that we can see it is driven by the main actor, which is state, and it's kind of found in bits and pieces differently, but it's framed as policy because effectively these policies are constituted even though they are not found in a very specific intention and defined purpose and defined measures and defined actors. It gives us a shift from state as sole actor to network of actors in terms of looking at the policy, not only in terms of a single actor resolving the problem, but actually of the society setting the problem, deciding on what problems to act, but also then resolving the problem and kind of dealing with the consequences of this action. It's also making a shift from policy analysis to a policy critique, which I think majority of your interventions are going to fit into. And it allows us to include the study and links to policy narratives, which I'll try to explain a bit later. Tina, the next slide, please. The policy narratives is that, however, when we look at from the administrative side and we look at we see public policies as something which is not in the sphere of politics or in the public sphere. And very often when we do analysis, we focus on specific data and specific details and specific caveats of implementation and arguments and so on. But usually in the public sphere, public policies appear as policy narratives. And this is an approach to policy narrative framework, which this statement, I think, is very, very, very illustrative. Definitions of policy problems usually have narrative structure. That is, they are stories with a beginning, middle, and an end involving some change or transformation. They have heroes and villains and innocent victims, and they pit forces of evil against forces of good. In that sense, the policy narrative framework actually focuses not only on how the specific policies in terms of measures to resolve problems is formulated, adopted, and what are its consequences, and so on and so forth. But also it looks how these public policies play out in the public arena, how they are sold to the voters, how the politicians twist them and turn them, how they justify them, and so on. And usually you have these two main components, which I feel could be important on the ways for you to hook onto policy processes in this wider sense. And that is the narrative form, which is the characters, heroes, and villains. For example, when Donald Trump is trying to sell an immigration policy, anti-immigration policies, he's not telling them, these are the problems of immigration, they're taking our jobs, and these are the figures, and so on. It's saying we are building the wall, and the wall is there to cut us up from those who are invading and we who need protection. It has a setting which is usually a very specific time and place. It has a plot in terms of what is happening, and it has morals of the story. The narrative content, on the other side, are belief systems, which are already mentioned as values, but also the specific strategies political actors employ on very specific policies. And it has a causal mechanism in terms of providing some sort of explanations for why these policy changes are necessary or not necessary, but also why these policies have bad influence or not bad influence. And usually it goes into a devil-angel shift in terms of setting the things very black and white. And this is usually how the public policies are actually advocated for and in the public sphere, and how they appear for the general public, which is the general audience, is the audience of this paper. Next slide, please. Next slide, Tina, please. Yeah. So our goal is, I hope I'm giving you these two notions, these extra two goggles, how to actually look the public policy and kind of soften that perspective, or maybe not your unwillingness to venture into this area and kind of having some kind of negative attitudes towards it. And that is how you can actually now try to see how whatever your research specific research project is, how you can make it specifically relevant. The main features of this genre, and I'm going to focus because most of you are academics, is the different features of this genre, writing for the public policy or writing for the public in general. And the main goal, I would say, is getting attention and communicating are calling for attention or calling for action. And that is, instead of only producing knowledge and presenting knowledge in this paper, you should actually try to look at actionable knowledge. And that is, it's not only that you're looking to inform with the new data someone, but you're actually trying to pinpoint how this data inviting for specific action, or how is it relevant for a specific doing about certain social problem. So it's not only writing to inform or writing to enlighten, but it's also writing to induce social change. And that is kind of another feature of this genre. Instead of evidence and data, which is for you as a scientist, it's strategic evidence and the data. And that is what kind of data you can put to the fore for the communicating, and what the data is the most relevant in a specific context. This data, your specific context in which you're writing your papers, and you're writing to influence the public and public policy as such in this way. Next slide, please. So usually writing on public policies has been divided in these 4 sections, and this is an op-ed, which is a short 2-pager. The key quality is clarity of vision or statement of position on specific problem. The audience is usually a very general public, and it is short and effective and very simple, without much elaborations and without much explanations behind it. It's a clarity of vision or clarity of argument or clarity of a definition of a specific problems which you're trying to bring to the wider audience. The policy brief is mid-length, I would say. It's usually 5 pages. It's a focus on key issues of a specific policy. It has a policy explanation or a policy critique. It's choosing a single feature of that policy and trying to brief it. And the audience is usually the interested audience. It's not a general public. You don't publish it as an article in Times. It's something that is for interested public, which can be anyone from practitioners to kind of interested public. The policy analysis is usually weighing policy options for the problem. It's providing alternative solutions, alternative roads to be taken to tackle the problem, and then concluding on the best road to take. The audience is expert public. It is usually policy makers and policy decision makers in that area. It is something that is provided as information basis for decision making, not for general information on a specific issue. The policy study has no limit. It's a detailed elaboration of the problem and solution. It contains detailed and elaborate analysis of every policy aspect. And the audience is, I'm not sure really who. It's a specific policy geeks. It's those big books which are very often produced, but are a snapshot of the time and huge elaborations, but are not very widely communicated and not read by different publics. This is kind of the norm. As the limits that we've given to your paper as well, which is 3,000 words, if I'm not mistaken, it doesn't fit anywhere neatly, but also, as I've said, this is if we would look strictly and writing on public policies understood from the first goggles. For us, and next slide, I'll try to make some tips for this specific exercise, how and what you should pay attention to in writing the derivative of your research projects. First, decide on the framing of your own paper. Remember the framing as is important for framing policies, it's important for framing your paper as well. Through framing, you can actually decide, you can actually kind of highlight the problems you want to highlight, but also invite the audiences which you want to invite. For example, usual examples about framing is, for example, the issue with tobacco smoking. I'm a heavy smoker, and this is very close to my heart. So it's, you can frame it as a public health issue, right? And then you can discuss the problem which is set there is the problem when then has its own criteria for measurement in terms of what can we do to improve the public health. It's not focusing on individuals, it's increasing, the population as such. So you're looking at, the percentages of smokers and so on. But also you can frame it as an individual rights issue. And in terms of, unless it's a completely forbidden, you could discuss of policies how to make a more humane smoking areas and discuss it from that point of view. So how you're going to frame your own paper and how you're going to frame parts of your research, I think it's very important to pay attention to. The second is locate yourself in the public policy world in terms of for what policies, explicit or implicit, is my research relevant? Is it one policy or different or many different policies, and so on? And also remember these narratives. If you cannot find exactly the links to the specific policies in terms of state measures and so on, you can always find the links to specific narratives around those policies present in the public sphere. In that sense, your paper's relevance is actually fitted there. Locate yourself in the policy cycle. In that sense, I mean, Tina, can we get to the next slide, please? I think it is next slide. And this is what the policy cycle looks like. As we said, agenda setting, policy formation, policy implementation, policy review. As I see it, this kind of intervention that this kind of research can produce is usually in the agenda setting sphere. That's where we tackle the narratives as well, but that is also where we can have a conceptual clearings in terms of a common discussion on concepts which are evident in general knowledge or in a narrative or in a specific policy, and then try to offer some conceptual clearing with our new research. It can invite for a problem restatement in terms of saying that the problem identification of a specific policy is not right, that we should not look at this, but we should look at that we should not look at how much money are we giving to a specific policy, but how this money is being spent on whom, and so on. But also try to locate yourself in terms of timing of the intervention. It is location and time, processes and opportunities. Because while when we are dealing with the general narratives and dealing with the general policy, general discussions, this cycle is not that relevant, obviously. But however, there are specific opportunities where you can influence. If you know that there is a new policy being adopted, or if there is an event which triggered a debate on a specific policy narrative, those are the opportunities which you can grasp on and kind of hook to. Next slide, please. These tips, next steps, is basically more related to how you structure your papers and how what kind of techniques you could use. I would advise to include a summary. 10 pages, which is about approximately 3,000 words, is still a long paper, and a short summary would really help for any interested reader to see whether it wants to read it or not. Second is hook. I've read some of the papers. Hook is basically a journalistic genre. What is a hook? It's something that is going to engage the audience to stay with your paper. As I've said, attention and keeping the attention is something which is needed. So in that sense, empirical riddle, that's something that kind of breaks the common sense. So why is it that this happens when usually we would expect this to happen? Empirical, anthropological vignette. I think I've read one of the papers where a short anthropological vignette in terms of a specific statement from a study by words which are not the researcher is something that is very useful. It's what journalists would call a personal angle, which is something, a common knowledge, or something that it can grasp, we can elaborate, or can highlight the specific or common or uncommon way of thinking about things. Paradoxical statement, breaking news. So introduce some kind of hook somewhere in the beginning, right after the summary, very useful for someone to stay through your 10 pages. Include a relevant statement. Why is it worth reading? Mark the processes, policies, efforts, professions which should care about this. Dominant narratives which you're trying to challenge or for which your research is relevant. Concrete events which kind of taking a stance on these concrete events depend on taking into account the new data, the new insight you have with your papers. Outline the structure of the paper. I always offer for this public writing, use a sandwich structure. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Many of these things are going to be read online, are going to be skimmed through, giving a clear map how to go through this text. I think it's always a good idea. I know it's a bit boring, and I know it's a bit kind of formal, but yet these kinds of interventions. It's not really a literary text. Try to include recommendations. If not recommendations, here takeaways for whom this might be relevant, and then think interested parties or parties who should be interested. Which politicians, which professionals, which agencies, and so on. In which social processes these kinds of considerations are important. What are the common conceptions in which should be changed? What are the common narratives which could be changed? In that sense, try to give, at the end of the document, some kind of recommendations. If you have recommendations which are for a number of actors, do specify for whom this is, and literally write them down, because that is something that it's kind of a memorable takeaway for someone who is reading from a very different perspective and very different background, to actually be engaged and memorize something and take away something from the text. And finally, and this is kind of a very technical, and this facilitate skimming through text. The facilitation through skimming is, include graphical interventions of key statements. If your text has 5 pages, have a single statement on each page in which is something which invites and further discusses what is in that paragraph that you're writing about. It's graphically pleasing. It's kind of easier for the text to be read through, but it's also, for the skimmers, those who I read the first paragraph and then the 5th paragraph and then the 7th paragraph. These are kind of anchor points for your main points, which are then going to be distributed to the text. And do use shorter sections. If you don't want these graphical interventions inside the text, do use shorter sections. Do use kind of subtitles, which are for the skimmers. I'm not interested in this, but this sounds interesting, and so on. This would be kind of the tips I would provide for now. The next slide, please, Dina.
I'm trying to do the next slide. Okay.
Yeah, that's you can return it. Obviously, something happened here. It's a resource slide. So this was a quick squeeze. I've managed, I think, in half an hour, which is my goal. I'm obviously open for questions, and also let me clarify the role. I'm going to be in communication with each and every one of you, because I'm reading all the papers and I'm going to provide feedback, which hopefully is going to kind of improve that. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Anna.
Thanks. Thank you, Srđan, for this very thorough and helpful and useful and beyond useful presentation. It's a lot, I have to say. This is not a way I and maybe some others of us have used to write. And to me, this seems like I have to do a whole new research just to get myself into ability to write 5, 6, 7 pages of this policy analysis. So is this the ideal form that we should strive for, but cannot achieve it in 15 days now? Because previous to this presentation, what we knew is that there is going to be an essay as an obligation, and that it should communicate to a wider audience, but nothing so specific as writing a proper policy analysis, which I've never did the research on policy measures and whatnot, audiences, which are, it's useful to think about it, and it's useful to have it in mind while writing, but yeah, I'm
Anna,
just
if
a
I
little
can
overwhelmed, to be honest.
if I can respond rightly, absolutely not. As I've mentioned, the idea is not to turn this into a policy analysis papers. The idea is, and as you've seen from the tips, I'm not recommending any specific formats and so on. I try to provide specific tips, and obviously, just as you phrased it, to keep on mind what we are talking about, not to think about specific policies and go now and study when is this law changed and is going to be changed and so on. It is, let me say, a way, or I've tried to provide a goggle for looking at the bigger picture, but with some dots and kind of, how to look at the bigger picture and how to connect. Many of these things, to be honest, is a single sentence intervention, just, thinking of whatever your research has been, thinking of, who this might be interesting for is kind of not really a specific research, but, thinking 10 minutes about, who might this read? Would this be interesting for who's government officials or not? Would this be interesting for a specific activist? Would this be interesting for some specific organizations? Who would care about this? And really, main idea is actually, as you phrased it, keep this in mind. We will share this presentation. Keep this in mind and look at, how can I fit into this? Where can I fit, and where can I find these connections? Few connections through the text is something which would absolutely completely do in terms of your specific essay, and that's basically it. Many of other tips, to be honest, are generally tips for effective writing. So it's yeah, it's I think it's there. So no, not there. No format, no letter, no specific. The idea.
Thanks.
No, thank you very much, Srđan. That was very useful and instructive, and I think that we are privileged to have this with you, and thank you in advance for going through all these op-eds, and I'm certain that you will be in touch with each author and then do it back and forth, and that this can result in a future publication that we can prepare in Rijeka. Yes, go on, Joe.
I just have a quick question. Srđan, you mentioned that you'll be reading all of our papers that we turn in and then giving us feedback. I was just wondering, maybe if it's even possible to elaborate on how that process will look like, because I believe we have, 2 weeks before the end of our project to turn that in. So is this like a quick turnaround thing or something to kind of keep working on as, after the project, or something that should be taken from your, like, should we implement your feedback like as soon as possible, or
well, we'll try to provide feedback as soon as you submit your papers, and that feedback it's going to be a bit of a tweaks, and we are completely understand that it's some of it you wrote a lot already, but I think a lot of, in terms of small editing can actually improve the text. The comments are basically just like a revision. I'm going to give you comments on a written text. For people who are still didn't complete writing, this might be instructive when writing in terms of including those sentences. People who already wrote, I'm going to kind of be a very specific with these tips on a specific paper, and then you can implement it or not implement it. I would obviously advise you to implement what you can. What is too much or a burden for you, obviously is not expected. We are introducing this format and so on, and it's a bit learning by doing. So the specific procedure, we have not outlined it as precisely as Irena. I think you have a addition to that.
Yeah, I just want to say that to respect the contract and your obligations, you need to submit the draft of this text 2 weeks before the end of your contract. but everything needs to be done before 15th of July because we have an end of the project while we have to publish your work. So because the project, obviously you're not having the fellowship at the same time, but the end of the project, before that we need to publish the publication. So have that in mind when giving the feedback to Srđan and working with him after your contract ends. But don't be afraid of this process because it's not going to be, I mean, now it looks like it's very unachievable, but we've been through this, I mean, Srđan and me with other fellows previously, and it's very constructive and very useful, and it's not going to be, I mean, you're not going to rewrite all of your papers, so don't worry about it. It's going to be fine. It's going to be easy and we're flexible, so don't worry about it. And you will have the presentation after this, so that's also fine.
We can figure out a bit of outline from this session as well as tips that can go to all others that are not present today, because of course, speaking to you present here, you are aware of all the tricks behind the process, but some of you should also have a written outline, and we will do that. No worries. Well, in a few days, we will provide that. And yeah, it's a good thing, good exercise. Nothing to worry about. You're all experts in your field.
And I'm not expert in any of your fields. So my
that's it. That's a technique. It's just
it's a technique. It's basically, I'm there to kind of, a bit as a lame audience or a bit more specialized or informed audience to give you, what is, from my perspective, something that can be improved and how this can be a bit more relevant for different readers. Definitely not going to get your thesis is wrong, please change this, and so on. It's basically, more of a...
Of course, it's more of an exercise of style than
Exactly.
else. So
of style and structures and so on. So it's basically, that's it. The intention was not...
We should not add to any of it. So I think it's good time to end this. Thank you for your time, and looking forward to see you next week. And stay.
Yeah. Have in mind that next week we have a time difference change because Daniel is having his lecture, and due to time difference that he's there and availability in Lovro, we are having it at 5 p.m. So we'll make sure you know.
Yeah. Just afternoon tea. That's it. Thank you and take care. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.